Here we are again. I wonder how many of you have noticed my t-shirt that I wear in honour of James Joyce, Nighttown, from the Circe episode of Ulysses, which is set in a brothel. I just thought it was worth bringing up because things were digging deep into morality at the moment. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Not that there's anything wrong with brothels, but anyway, I won't go there. Spirit. Spirit that is certain of itself, morality. Dissemblance or duplicity. In the moral view of the world, we see on the one hand consciousness itself consciously produce its object. We see that it neither encounters the object as something alien to it, nor does the object come before it in an unconscious manner. On the contrary, it proceeds in every case in accordance with the principle on the basis of which it posits objective being. It thus knows this latter to be its own self, for it knows itself to be the active agent that produces it. It seems therefore to attain here its peace and satisfaction, for this can only be found where it no longer needs to go beyond its object, because this no longer goes beyond it. On the other hand, however, consciousness itself really places the object outside itself as a beyond of itself, but this object with an intrinsic being of its own is equally posited as being, not free from self-consciousness, but as existing in the mind in the interest of and by means of it. The moral worldview is therefore in fact nothing other than the elaboration of this fundamental contradiction in its various aspects. It is, to employ here a Kantian expression where it is most appropriate, a whole nest of thoughtless contradictions. The way in which consciousness proceeds in this development is to establish one moment and to pass directly from it to another, setting aside the first. But now, as soon as it has set up this second moment, it also sets it aside again, and really makes the opposite moment the essential one. At the same time, it is also aware of its contradiction and shiftiness, for it passes from one moment, immediately in its relation to this very moment, over to the opposite. Because a moment has no reality for it, it posits that very same moment as real, or what comes to the same thing, in order to assert one moment as possessing being in itself. It asserts the opposite as the one that possesses being in itself. In so doing, it confesses that, as a matter of fact, it is in earnest with neither of them. We must examine more closely the moments of this insincere shuffling. Let us, to begin with, not question the assumption that there is an actual moral consciousness, because the assumption is made directly and not in connection with something preceding. And let us turn to the harmony of morality and nature, the first postulate. It is supposed to be an implicit harmony, not explicitly for actual consciousness, not present. On the contrary, what is present is rather only the contradiction of the two. In the present, morality is assumed as already in existence, and actuality is so placed that it is not in harmony with it. The actual moral consciousness, however, is one that acts. It is precisely therein that the actuality of its morality consists, but in the very doing or acting, the place given to actuality is displaced, for the action is nothing other than the actualization of the inner moral purpose, nothing other than the production of an actuality determined by the purpose, or of the harmony of the moral purpose and actuality itself. At the same time, the performance of the action is a fact of which consciousness is aware. It is the presence of this unity of actuality and purpose, and because in the accomplished deed consciousness knows itself to be actualized as this particular consciousness, or beholds existence returned into itself, and enjoyment consists in this, there is also contained in the actuality of the moral purpose that form of actuality which is called enjoyment and happiness. Action, therefore, in fact, directly fulfills what was asserted could not take place. what was supposed to be merely a postulate, merely a beyond. Consciousness thus proclaims, through its deed, that it is not in earnest in making its postulate, because the meaning of the action is really this, to make into a present reality what was not supposed to exist in the present. And since the harmony is postulated for the sake of the action, that is to say, what is to become actual through action, must be so in itself, otherwise actuality would not be possible. The connection of action and postulate is so constituted that, for the sake of the action, that is, for the sake of the actual harmony of purpose and actuality, this harmony is postulated as not actual, as a beyond. Since action does take place, the lack of fitness between purpose and reality is not taken seriously at all. On the other hand, action itself does seem to be taken seriously. In point of fact, however, the actual deed is only a deed of the individual consciousness, and therefore itself only something individual and the result contingent. But the purpose of reason as the universal, all-embracing purpose, is nothing less than the whole world. A final purpose going far beyond the content of this individual deed, and therefore to be placed altogether beyond anything actually done. Because the universal best ought to be carried out, nothing good is done. In fact, however, the nullity of what is actually done, and the reality of the whole purpose alone, which are now postulated, these two are in every respect again displaced. The moral action is not something contingent and restricted, for it has as its essence pure duty. This constitutes the sole entire purpose, and thus the deed, no matter in what other way its content is limited, is qua actualization of that purpose, the accomplishment of the entire absolute purpose. Or again, if reality is taken to be nature, which has its own laws, and stands in contrast to pure duty, so that duty cannot realize its law within nature, then since it is duty as such that essentially matters, what we are in fact concerned with is not the fulfillment of pure duty, which is the whole purpose, for the fulfillment would really have as its purpose not pure duty, but its antithesis of reality. But there is again a shift from the position that is not reality with which we are concerned, for according to the notion of moral action, pure duty is essentially an act of consciousness. Thus, there certainly ought to be action, absolute duty ought to be expressed in the whole of nature, and moral law to become natural law. If then we allow that it is this highest good that essentially matters, then consciousness is not in earnest with morality at all, for in this highest good nature does not have a different law from that of morality. Hence moral action itself is ruled out, for action takes place only on the assumption of a negative which is to be set aside by the action. But if nature is a conformity with the moral law, the latter would in fact be violated by the setting aside of what is in existence. In the assumption that the highest good is what essentially matters, there is admitted a situation in which moral action is superfluous, and does not take place at all. The postulate of the harmony of morality and reality, a harmony posited by the notion of moral action, which implies bringing the two into agreement, is expressed from this point of view too, in the form, because moral action is the absolute purpose is that there should be no such thing as moral action. When we put together these moments which consciousness has traversed in its ideas of morality, it is clear that each one in turn is superseded in its opposite. Consciousness starts from the idea that for it morality and reality do not harmonize, but it is not in earnest about this. For in the deed, the presence of this harmony becomes explicit for it, but it is not in earnest even about this deed, since the deed is something individual, for it has such a high purpose, the highest good, but this again is only a dissemblance of the facts, for such dissemblance would do away with all action and all morality. In other words, consciousness is not, strictly speaking, in earnest with moral action. What it really holds to be most desirable, to be the absolute, is that the highest good be accomplished and that moral action be superfluous. From this result, consciousness must go on still further in its contradictory movement, and of necessity again dissemble this suppression of moral action. Morality is in itself the merely implicit element. If it is to be actual, the final purpose of the world cannot be fulfilled. Rather, the moral consciousness must exist on its own account and find itself confronted by a nature opposed to it. But it must be perfected in its own self. This leads to the second postulate of the harmony of itself and the nature which is immediately an element in it, and that is the sense nature. Moral consciousness asserts that its purpose is pure, is independent of inclination and impulse, which implies that it has eliminated within itself sensuous purposes. But this alleged elimination of the element of sense, it dissembles again. It acts, brings its purpose into actual existence, and the self-conscious sense nature, which is supposed to be eliminated, is precisely this middle term or mediating element between pure consciousness and actual existence. It is the instrument or organ of the former for its realization, and what is called impulse, inclination. Most self-consciousness is not, therefore, in earnest with the elimination of inclination and impulse, for it is just these that are the self-realizing self-consciousness. But also they ought not to be suppressed, but only to be in conformity with reason, and they are in conformity with reason, for moral action is nothing else but consciousness realizing itself, thus giving itself the shape of an impulse, that is, it is immediately the present harmony of impulse and morality. But impulse is not in fact merely this empty shape, which could have within it a spring of action other than the one it is, and be impelled by it, for sense nature is one which contains within itself its own laws and springs of action. Consequently, morality cannot therefore be in earnest about being itself the mainspring of impulses, the angle of inclination for inclinations, for since these have their own fixed quality and peculiar content, the consciousness to which they were to conform would be rather in conformity with them, a conformity with which moral self-consciousness refuses to comply. The harmony of the two is thus merely implicit, merely postulated. In moral action, the actually present harmony of morality and the sense nature was just now asserted, but now is displaced. The harmony is beyond consciousness in a nebulous remoteness, where nothing can any more be accurately distinguished or comprehended. For our attempt just now to comprehend this unity failed. In this merely implicit harmony, however, consciousness surrenders itself altogether. This implicit harmony is its moral perfection, where the struggle of morality and the sense nature has ceased, and the latter is in conformity with morality in a way that is beyond our comprehension. For that reason, this perfection is again only a dissemblance, a falsification of the situation, since as a matter of fact it would be rather morality itself that was given up in that perfection, because it is only consciousness of absolute purpose as pure purpose, one therefore opposed to all other purposes. Morality is both the activity of this pure purpose and also the consciousness of rising above sense nature, of being mixed up with sense nature and struggling against it. That consciousness is not in earnest about the perfection of morality is indicated by the fact that consciousness itself shifts it away into infinity, and that is, asserts that the perfection is never perfected. What consciousness really holds to be the truth of the matter is only this intermediate state of imperfection, a state nevertheless which at least is supposed to be a progress towards perfection. But it cannot even be that, for to advance in morality would really to be moved toward its disappearance. That is to say, the goal would be the nothingness or the abolition, mentioned above, of morality and consciousness itself. But to approach ever nearer to nothingness means to diminish. Besides, advancing as such, like diminishing, would assume quantitative difference in morality, but there can be no question of these in it. In morality, as in consciousness, for which the moral purpose is pure duty, there cannot be any thought at all of a difference, least of all of the superficial one of quantity. There is only one virtue, only one pure duty, only one morality. Since then, it is not moral perfection that is taken seriously, but rather the intermediate state, that is, as just argued, non-morality. We thus return, from another aspect, to the content of the first postulate, namely, we cannot understand how happiness is to be demanded for this moral consciousness on the ground of its worthiness. It is aware of its imperfection and cannot therefore in point of fact demand happiness as a desert, as something of which it is worthy. It can only ask for happiness to be granted as a free act of grace. That is, it can only ask for happiness as such, as something existing in and for itself, and can expect it not on the absolute ground mentioned above, but as coming to it by chance and caprice. Here then, non-morality declares just what it is, that it is concerned not about morality, but solely about happiness as such, without reference to morality. By the second aspect of the moral view of the world, the other assertion of the first aspect, in which the disharmony of morality and happiness is assumed, is also nullified. It is claimed that experience shows that in this present world the moral individual often fares badly, while the immoral individual often flourishes. But the intermediate state of an imperfect morality, which has shown itself to be the essential one, ideally shows that this observation, this supposed experience, is merely a dissemblance of the true state of the case. For since morality is imperfect, that is, morality in fact is not, what can there be in the experience that morality has fares badly? Since at the same time it has turned out that it is happiness simply as such that is involved, it is evident that in making the judgment that the immoral individual flourishes, it was not intended to imply that an injustice occurred here. The designation of an individual as immoral necessarily falls away when morality in general is imperfect, and has therefore only an arbitrary basis. Therefore, the sense and content of the judgment of experience is solely this, that happiness simply as such should not have been the lot of some individuals. That is, the judgment is an expression of envy which covers itself with the cloak of morality. The reason, however, why so-called good luck should fall to the lot of others is good friendship, which grants and wishes them, and itself too, this lucky chance. Morality, then, in the moral consciousness is imperfect. This is now what is put forward, but it is the essence of morality to be only the perfectly pure. Imperfect morality is therefore impure, or is immorality. Morality itself thus exists in another being than the actual consciousness. This other being is a holy and moral lawgiver. The imperfect morality in consciousness, which is the reason for making these postulates, means in the first instances that morality, when it is posited in consciousness as actual, stands in relation to an other, to an existence, and therefore itself receives within its otherness, or difference, giving rise to a whole variety of moral laws. The moral self-consciousness, at the same time, however, holds these many duties to be unessential, for it is concerned only with the one pure duty, and the many have no truth for it, insofar as they are specific duties. They can therefore have their truth only in another being, and are made sacred, which they are not for the moral consciousness, by a holy lawgiver. But this again is only a dissemblance of the real position, for the real self-consciousness, for the moral self-consciousness, is its own absolute, and duty is absolutely only what it knows as duty. But duty it knows only as a pure duty, which is not sacred for it, is not sacred in itself. What is not sacred for it is not sacred in itself. And what is not in itself sacred cannot be made sacred by the holy being. The moral consciousness, too, is not really in earnest about letting something be made sacred by another, consciousness and itself, for that alone it holds to be sacred, which it has itself made sacred, and is sacred in it. It is, therefore, just a little in earnest about the holiness of this other being, for in this something was supposed to obtain an essentiality, which for the moral consciousness, that is, in itself, it did not possess. If the holy being was postulated in order that in it duty might have its validity, not as pure duty, but as a multiplicity of specific duties, then this again must be dissembled, and the other being alone must be holy in it so far as it is pure duty, as only pure duty has validity in it. Pure duty has also in point of fact, a validity only in another being, not in the moral consciousness, although in the latter it seems that pure morality alone has validity, the position must be put in another way, for it is at the same time a natural consciousness. In it morality is affected and conditioned by the sense nature, and is therefore not free and independent, but contingent on free will. In it, however, as pure will, morality is contingent on knowledge. Morality, therefore, in and for itself, is in another being. This other being, then, is here the purely perfect morality, for in it morality does not stand in a relation to nature and sense, but the reality of pure duty is its realization in nature and sense. The moral consciousness attributes its imperfection to the fact that in it morality has a positive relation to nature and sense, because it holds that an essential moment in morality is that it should have a negative and only a negative relation to them. The pure moral being, on the other hand, because it is above the struggle with nature and sense, does not stand in a negative relation to them. Therefore, in fact, there remains for it only the positive relation to them. That is, just what moment ago was imperfect. That is, just what a moment ago was qua imperfect, held to be immoral, but a pure morality that was completely separated from reality, and so likewise was without any positive relation to it, would be an unconscious, unreal abstraction in which the concept of morality, which involves thinking of pure duty, winning and doing it, would be done away with. Such a purely moral being is therefore again a dissemblance of the facts and has to be given up. In this purely moral being, however, the moments of the contradiction in which the synthetic presentation of them flounders about are brought closer together, and consciousness lets these opposites follow one after the other, one always being replaced by the other without bringing its thoughts together, so that in the end it is forced to give up itself. It is forced to give up its moral view of the world and seek refuge within itself. It knows its morality to be imperfect because it is affected by the sense nature and nature opposed to it, which in part adulterate morality itself as such, and in part give rise to a host of duties, by which, in concrete cases of real action, it is embarrassed. For each case in the concrescence of many moral relations, just as an object of perception in general is a thing many properties, and since this specific duty is a purpose, it has a content, and its content is part of the purpose, and morality is not pure. This latter, therefore, has its reality in another being. This reality, however, means nothing else than that the being of morality here is both intrinsic and explicit. Explicit, that is, it is the morality of a conscious being, and intrinsic, that is, it has an existence and a reality. In that first imperfect consciousness, morality is not realized. There it is the in itself or merely implicit being in the sense of a mere thought thing, for it is associated with nature and sense, and with the reality of being and consciousness which constitutes its content, and nature and sense are morally nothing. In the second consciousness, morality exists as perfect and not as an unrealized thought thing, but this perfection consists precisely in morality having reality in a consciousness, as well as a free reality, and existence in general in being something not empty but fulfilled, full of content. That is, the perfection of morality is placed in the fact that what has just been characterized as merely nothing, as morally nothing, is present in it and intrinsic to it. On one hand, it is supposed to have validity simply and solely as the unreal thought thing of pure abstraction, and then again equally to have no validity in that mode. Its truth is supposed to consist in its being opposed to reality and to be entirely free and empty of it, and then again to consist in its being reality. The syncretism of these contradictions, which is set forth at length in the moral view of the world, collapses internally, since the distinction on which it rests, the distinction between what must be thought and postulated, and yet is at the same time not essential, becomes a distinction which no longer exists even in words. What finally is posited as diverse, both as nothing and also as reality, is one and the very same thing, namely existence and reality, and what is supposed to be absolute only as the beyond of real being and consciousness, and that equally to be absolute only in them, and so as a beyond to be nothing. This absolute is pure duty, and the knowledge of duty as essence. The consciousness which makes this distinction, that is no distinction, which asserts that actual existence has no validity, and at the same time that it is real. That pure morality is both truly essential and also devoid of essence. Such a consciousness expresses in one and the same breath the thoughts which it previously separated, and itself proclaims that it is not in earnest about this determination and separation of the moments of self and inner self or intrinsic being, but that on the contrary, what it asserts as having absolute being outside of consciousness, it really keeps enclosed within the self of self-consciousness, and that what it asserts to have absolute being in thought, or to be absolutely intrinsic being, it for that very reason takes to be something that has no truth. Consciousness comes to see that the placing apart of these moments is a displacing of them, a dissemblance, and that it would be hypocrisy if, nevertheless, it were to keep them separate. But as moral, pure self-consciousness, it flees from the disparity between the way it thinks of these moments and its own essential nature, flees from this untruth which asserts that to be true which it holds to be untrue, flees from this with abhorrence back into itself. It is a pure conscience which rejects with scorn such a moral idea of the world. It is in its own self the simple spirit that certain of itself acts conscientiously, regardless of such ideas, and in this immediacy possesses its truth, while, however, this world of dissembling is nothing else but the development of moral self-consciousness in its moments, and hence is its reality, its essential nature. By retreating into itself, will not become anything different. Its retreat into itself means rather that consciousness has realized that its truth is a pretended truth. It would always have to be giving out this pretended truth as its truth, for it would have to express and present itself as an objective idea, but would be aware that all this is merely a dissemblance. It would therefore be in fact hypocrisy, and the scornful rejection of that dissemblance would be itself the first expression of hypocrisy. A Venetian mask. Those were the days. I'd love to have attended something like that. However, as you'll have noticed during COVID, and this is always the problems with mass superheroes, if it is somebody you know and you see them in a mask, you recognize them. So I suppose their faces must have been completely covered up. But then you recognize the voice anyway. Anyway, I digress. I continue with morality later. Such as I know about it.